After looking at all the reference images and defining the landmarks and figuring out kind of how the skeletal structure works, it's time for us to physically start creating some shapes inside of our three-dimensional scene. But which pose are we going to choose to sculpt at and to generate all of this information in? It's important that we set the foundation for our model pretty early on, and we're creating a sculpture in a foundation level of polygons that's going to serve the rest of the production pipeline. Remember all those stages? Well, we're going to be living with this pose for some time, so it's important that we kind of nail it down and figure out a good one before we go any further. Each animal is going to be wildly different, and creature is going to be wildly different from one another. But there is kind of a consistent level of thinking that comes to the choosing of the correct sculpting pose, and here's a good place to begin. We want to try to find a sculpting pose that defines the appendages at their most extreme. If you look at the way that I've posed this character's front arm and its back leg, for example, are at their most extreme. They're not all balled up, they're not deformed, they're straight down. We're always going to have the ability to pose our character after. If we have all of our appendages straight, like we have here inside of our scene, it gives us choices later on down the production pipeline. This asset is going to be used in a number of different areas of the production pipeline, including animation and character rigging. So we want to make sure that we're creating a character and a sculpture that can be deformed, that can be bent and rigged with an internal animation skeletal system. So having nice straight legs, or as straight as we can, is really helpful. Now, if you look very carefully, and some of you out there are like, Pat, those are not straight legs. Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. And this front leg is a really great example of this. There's a little bit of a bow in here. And I've done the exact same thing on the back leg as well. I want to describe in this sculpt pose how the mass of the character and the weight of the character is being translated and transferred down into the ground. I've established a nice plane here that creates the mass. The back part of our block out in the sculpt pose is suggesting that mass. And I can see that mass is being translated down into the feet with this simple little bow in the leg itself. We want to start suggesting the weight of this character in this sculpt pose. It allows our character riggers and the entire production process to understand how heavy this character is intended to be. The sculpture is designed to inform but also create opportunities for the rest of the artisans within our production pipeline to make the best possible illusion and craft that they can. We also want to try to make sure that our character is as symmetrical as we can make it inside of this initial sculpt pose. If you look at this character from the front, yeah, it's pretty symmetrical across the x-axis. We want to make sure that we're producing a symmetrical character so that the wireframe geometry, the topology, which we'll talk a lot about in the future, is the same on both sides. That allows our character to be UV mapped and rigged and rendered in a way that is efficient and error-free. So having a symmetrical sculpt pose is ideal, or as close as we can have it. Characters are almost always symmetrical across the x-axis. It's easy to make our character symmetrical at first, and then at the conclusion of our sculpting process, after this entire thing is basically done, we can go back in and make things asymmetrical. Starting off with a symmetrical pose is going to make it easier for us as the sculpture to understand how to use these tools and the correct recipe of workflows to get the final result that we're after. So making sure that it's symmetrical across the x-axis is also super critical. In addition, we also want to make sure that our character is being sculpted and created pointing the correct direction inside of our three-dimensional scene. All characters need to have the nose, their eyes. They need to be looking, for lack of a better word, towards the negative side of the y-axis. So they need to be looking down here. I'm looking at my scene from the top. All characters, this is kind of one of our industry standard ideas, should be looking towards the negative side of the y-axis, which is also pretty neat. In addition, if we look at our character from the side, you can see the feet clearly are structured and planted in the middle of the z-axis. So it's standing on the ground, if you will. It's not centered along the z-axis. The feet are centered on the z-axis, which is going to allow our character riggers and the rest of our texture pipeline to work and smooth much more cleanly. Us 3D modelers and sculptors have a big responsibilities. We are the first link of a very long chain of sequence of steps. The entire project is built on the foundation that we create in the sculpture. So we want to make sure that it's positioned correctly, that it's formatted correctly, and we're producing the correct sculpting pose to allow the rest of the artisans inside of our production pipeline to do the very best work that they can do. The entire project is built on our foundation, so we got to get it right.